Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Thanks for joining me again. Today, I'm talking about how that little voice in your head takes things a little too personally sometimes. In my opinion, I think this shows up in so many different flavors, and I talk about all of those in this episode. Those flavors are telling yourself it's all your fault, or that self-directed blame, inability to accept a compliment, or praise for a job well done, if we straight up just take things too personally, when we feel like we can't say no or go against the grain or disagree or let our voice be heard, and then in our life's work and how we show up for what we were put on earth to do. So if any of those things sound good for you, awesome, keep listening. I'm happy to have you here with me. I hope that this episode is enlightening and refreshing and all of the things that you hope that it will be. So without further ado, welcome to the Get Out of Your Head podcast, where we talk all about the stories that keep you stuck, blocked from manifesting what you really want, and away from your authentic life. I am your host, Sarah, from Spirit, Mind, Body. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I am excited to have you here with me today. Last time I talked about egocentricity as sort of this ego story, and I wasn't planning on doing a second follow-up episode as I have been doing, but I figured that there was just a lot of things that I didn't say that I wanted to say, and so this one is sort of a follow-up to the last one. But the running theme throughout this episode, I'm going to talk about how it is when we're stuck in this me, I'm the center of the universe, egocentricity type of story, and how we tend to take things a little too personally. And then, of course, some of the things that we can do to get out of it. So this story shows up in a lot of different ways. The way that we take things just a little too personally takes on a lot of different flavors, and I just want to outline some of them for you. I have 5 today, I believe. Yes, I have 5 today, so let's just roll right into it. So first off, we tell ourselves it's all my fault. This is sort of this self-directed blame. First off, the ego loves to blame. It's really easy when we have somebody to blame to point a finger and say it's their fault, it was their doing, and it's therefore their responsibility to fix it. When we blame, it sort of implies that there's a solution, and of course, when we blame others, that solution is all of a sudden put on them to resolve. It's their responsibility to figure it out. But when we blame ourselves, it becomes sort of empowering in a very twisted way. I have the large tendency, I blame a lot, just be honest with you guys. And I think I probably blame myself more than anybody else, because when I blame myself, it gives me this illusion that I have the ability to fix whatever is wrong, whether or not I can. And so when you assume that it's your fault, it is better than being the victim, right? It's better than being a victim of your circumstance. It kind of elevates you. If you were to look at your frequency or vibration, it's better than staying in a state of hopelessness, which is kind of where the victim lies. And so when we put blame on ourselves, we kind of rise out of that, but it is not productive. Unjustified or non-rational self-blame is actually not only counterproductive, but it's actually quite dangerous because it comes with this illusion that we have the power to change it. But we have to be honest about these things. Some things are outside of our control entirely. Some things we just don't have the ability to affect or to change. And instead of putting your energy and time where it has the chance to make an impact, you start sort of spinning your wheels or trying to control things that ultimately are not in your control. You cannot control everything. That's just a fact of life. And when you assume unnecessary or unjustified blame, when someone else is actually at fault, like if there is an actual person to blame and it is somebody else's fault, or that it's their responsibility to fix, what you're doing is you're taking power and that opportunity for them to fix it away from them. So this can show up in a couple different ways. I just want to give you guys a couple examples so that it becomes really tangible for you. It could be that you pick up a coworker's workload that they didn't get done. It could be a coworker, it could be somebody on your same level, it could be your boss, it could be somebody, a subordinate. Either way, when you're picking up workload that was not your responsibility because it just had to get done, you not only take that away from them because that is their responsibility and they should have to face consequences, otherwise you're never going to learn. But you also assume that responsibility to fix it when it might not be your responsibility to fix in the first place. And what tends to happen in this case is that you set this precedence that you can do everything or be there for everybody. And so you end up taking on all of this responsibility that you as a human may not physically have the ability or time or energy to do. It could be picking up a family member's debt that they've racked up. We have this tendency to want to save people in our lives or to want to help people where we can. And that's good when it comes with boundaries, of course. But when we assume somebody else's mistake, either financial or personal or whatever it may be, and we take that on as our responsibility to fix, we not only don't give them the opportunity to fix it themselves, but we also take on somebody else's responsibilities and abilities to do things for themselves. It could be assuming that if you were different, that would make somebody else's life easier. And I'm mostly talking about relationships with toxic people. I see this kind of a lot. When somebody is trying to convince you that if you were just to do this, if you were just to look like that, if you were just to be different than the way you are, choose a different career path, lose some weight, or do things that make you abandon yourself or the path that you're trying to walk, that person is probably not a great person to have in your life. And I understand that that gets really tricky when it's somebody who's really close to us in our lives, like if it was, a parent or maybe even a spouse. But if you're not ready to cut that relationship off entirely, then that does come with some major boundaries that need to be put in place. It is never your responsibility to please somebody else if it requires you to abandon yourself. Your responsibility is to yourself first and foremost, and then the way that you impact somebody else is going to be different for everybody. You're never going to please everybody else. And when you do try to go about pleasing everybody else, your energy is not only spread to the wind, but you're simultaneously dishonoring your own path. Does that make sense? It could also be otherwise absorbing the emotional consequences of somebody else's behavior, actions, or opinions. To go along with that last point, people are going to have reactions to things that you do. And the things that you can do can be completely neutral, and somebody could have a really positive reaction to what you do, and somebody can have a very negative reaction to what you do. And what we try to do in this story, where we tell ourselves it's all my fault, is we'll sort of be like, I don't want you to have that negative reaction. I don't like having negative reactions. And so I'm going to mold myself into the person that you want me to be in order for you not to have that negative reaction. Here's the deal. Everybody is triggered at their own pace. When you do this work, what you start to realize is that your own triggers will point to you where you need to heal so that you can become the best person possible. And so the way that I look at it, and it is easier said than done, I will absolutely agree, but the way that I look at it is that if I'm triggering you or if I'm triggering somebody else, then ultimately good. That is something for that person to work on. And I don't try to trigger somebody, but I am not going to shy down and back away from showing up as the complete version of myself. So if somebody doesn't like what I'm doing, or if somebody doesn't like what I'm saying, then that's for them to work on. And I talk a lot about how to place boundaries, what you can do to place boundaries with other people in your life in my episode all about boundaries, which I will link in the show notes below. But that would be a really good one to go to that would have a lot of good information for you if you're struggling with this kind of thing, if you kind of just assume that things are your fault when things go bad. Another way that this sort of story shows up in another flavor is when we assume that somebody's bad day is about me. Have you ever met, or maybe you are this person, when you perceive or somebody perceives that you're having a bad day, the first question is, are you mad at me? And assuming that is kind of like saying, what did I do? It's all my fault. And I think that it's important to be perceptive about somebody else's emotional state and what you may or may not have done. But over the top assumptions of responsibility for someone else's emotional state is never healthy. This also brings up a good question. Why is it so bad if somebody has a bad day? If you have this belief that bad days are so bad and you're not allowed to have bad days yourself, you're going to automatically assume that somebody else's bad day is something to be avoided, and then you're going to go over the top trying to change it. I'm saying you're going to as a very blanket statement. Of course, you decide whether that's true for you or not, but when you go over the top trying to change somebody else's emotional state, where do you abandon yourself in that process? Let me remind you that you are a finite being with finite time and energy, and other people's problems, bad days, are for them to sort out, and it may or may not be your quote-unquote fault. And, it's worth maybe asking the question if you do believe that you were a contributor. But if you're the type of person that does this automatically, if this is how your people pleaser sort of shows up in a lot of ways, I would encourage you to ask yourself, if I'm spending my time trying to correct or trying to elevate somebody else's emotional state, what am I sacrificing in that meantime? What am I not doing so that I can pick somebody else up? And you can't save everybody. That's just the way it is. It's not your responsibility to save other people. It's your responsibility to save yourself. And in doing so, you provide the space for other people to save themselves. Does that make sense? Okay. The second way that this shows up, this taking things personally, is the inability to accept a compliment or praise for a job well done. So I think sometimes this ego story, or the way that this pattern goes, is that it shows up as, it's sort of like self-doubt, but it's disguised as humility. When you do something worthwhile, being unwilling to accept praise for a job well done or downplaying your successes or contributions is sometimes like we tell ourselves, I'm being humble. If I'm downplaying my successes, you're trying to shine the spotlight away from you. You're trying to shine the spotlight on somebody else or something else. Or you tell yourself things like, well, I was just doing my job, or it wasn't that important, or, I'm just me and I'm nothing special. And it's a way of deflecting almost. But I think that what's under that and what's not spoken about is that we do have this really deep need and want to be seen for a job well done, or to be recognized for our contribution, even if it's something as small as looking good and inspiring somebody else to cut their hair a certain way, or whatever it may be. Deep down, we really want to be recognized for that. And because of that, secretly, we do want compliments. And the reason that we want compliments is because we don't 100% have that self-worth within, and so we keep putting it somewhere outside of ourselves. The worst versions of this is when somebody just absolutely can't take a compliment but constantly fishes for them. Do you know those kind of people? I mean, maybe that is even you in a way, and it's not a bad thing. I just tell you these things to bring them to light so that you're aware of them. But when you do that, when you fish for compliments, but then you can't take a compliment, what you're doing is you want everybody else to recognize you. But here's the thing, is that it doesn't matter how many people recognize you. You could get 1,000 compliments a day. You could get 1,000 recognitions a day. And if you don't believe in your own self, if you don't believe in your own worth, all the compliments in the world will never be enough. It will never be enough to satisfy that craving for worth and validation. I also think that we do this because somehow we think that in some way accepting a compliment might be either boastful or self-absorbed. Forever I couldn't put my face on social media. I had a really hard time taking selfies or going on video because I didn't want to be vain or self-absorbed or come across as boastful or arrogant. And that was my own personal thing that I had tied to it. I had to overcome or crumple that belief system to get over that, right? I had to really address, well, what do I believe in it? Do I believe that if somebody posts a selfie that they're vain or arrogant? No, people can post. I know a lot of people who post selfies and I don't think they're vain or arrogant or self-absorbed at all. And so I had to really readdress that core belief. And so maybe it's a process for you of addressing what your core beliefs are and seeing if it needs a shift. Maybe it's a process of figuring out where you're trying to solicit your self-worth to someone else outside of you and where you're giving that power away. Either way, this is my straight up practical advice for you. If you have a hard time accepting a compliment, don't take it so personally. Don't make it about you. That's the problem, and it's also the antidote. The problem is that you've made it so much about you and less about the other person. So when your awareness shifts to the other person and you think to yourself, wow, I helped them do something that they really needed help with, or I inspired them, or my contribution was really impactful. When you realize the benefit that provided for somebody else and your awareness is there, and then you also make it not about you, you sort of take this objective point of view and you say you can delight in somebody else's gain from your contribution. And in doing so, you look at somebody else and say, I'm happy for you. And I'm equally as happy that I could do it. It could have been anybody that provided you that benefit, and I'm glad it was me, And I think that is true humility, right? That's not humility that's disguised in self-doubt. That's true humility, being able to say, you know what, that's not about me. That whatever I provided to you, I'm glad that you were able to benefit from it, and it's not ultimately about me. It could have been anybody. Also, you can think about, how do you feel when you give somebody else a compliment and then they just accept it? And how do you feel when you give somebody a compliment and they don't accept it? Then you have to spend your time and your energy trying to convince them that they're worthy of this compliment, and it actually just takes way more energy away from you. When somebody else accepts your compliment, it doesn't take time or energy away from their space. They can just say it and move on. And when they make you feel good for making them feel good, everybody feels good. There's nothing to lose and everything to gain by accepting a compliment. Okay, the third thing is straight up just taking things too personally. It could be a comment, a compliment, a judgment, a criticism, unsolicited advice, whatever. Mostly in my life, I've experienced this in the way of either parenting or either people weighing in on what I should do for my career. I know that's kind of ridiculous, but a lot of people tend to think that they know what's best for me in my career, surprisingly. Anyway, it's all with good intention, but I do want to share a quick story with you. I was at the grocery store with my kids. I think I've told you guys my husband travels for work a lot, and so it's just frequently me and my two little ones. And when people see me, either if it's at the grocery store or an airport or out with two little ones, I get a variety of responses. And this one happened to be, how do I say, she was reminiscent. You could tell that she went there in her mind for when she was a young parent herself. And I made sort of an offhand remark and I was like, when does it get less stressful? And she kind of laughed about it, but then she was like, just remember, you're in charge. You have the power. And if you know me, I don't really parent that way. I don't look at parenting as a power struggle. I tend to look at it as I'm raising individuals, but I think that they are just as smart and capable and intelligent as I am. They just have a lot to learn and they do need boundaries, but it's never a power struggle. But I could tell in her eyes, it's almost weird. I had this moment where I was like, I could tell that she was reliving a time in her life when she was a young parent and she felt out of control and she felt like she didn't have the power. And I could tell that that was a moment for her of almost not regret, but of, how could I have done it differently? And then she was giving that advice to me. That's not a piece of advice I've heard that piece of advice before and I didn't need it. And so I wasn't writing it off, but I definitely considered it. And I said, okay, well, that wasn't necessarily for me. But here's the thing. I could have taken that really personally. Couldn't I have said to her or said to myself even, oh, you think that I'm not in charge? Or I could have even been like, oh, you think I parent that way? Or, oh, obviously you don't know about this, that, or the other thing about parenting. And don't you know people like this that sort of just jump to that conclusion of, well, you're making all these assumptions, you're doing all this stuff, and they take whatever it is so unbelievably personally, and it hurts everybody. It hurts yourself, it hurts the other person. The best way to go about this, to not take things personally, if you're the type of person that takes things personally, the best way to go about this is to read up on projections, to be honest. And I have a podcast episode or two, like a series, two of them, coming out in February regarding projections. So you can take a look at that, but realize essentially that everybody is looking at their environment and other people through their own lens, through their own experiences, through their own knowledge base. And whatever advice somebody has for you or whatever they have, however they see you is not about you. It's more about them. Their opinions is a reflection of them, not necessarily about you. Equally, if this is somebody that is chronic in your life, say an extended family member or even a very close family member that is constantly giving you unsolicited advice, maybe you get to know them a bit. Maybe you get to know their story and understand where they're coming from. And when you do, when you can get to know somebody else and you understand where they're coming from, then their offhand remarks or their unsolicited advice don't seem so personal. Altogether, the way to not take things personally is so incredibly obvious. Don't take things personally. Shift your awareness outside of yourself. Where is somebody else coming from? It's only personal if you make it personal. Does that make sense? The more that you realize that other people have their own lens that they view the world, the easier this gets. Number 4 is an unwillingness to say no or to go against the grain. When we feel like we can't say no, we have this sense that we don't want to rock the boat too much. We really want to keep the peace. And we feel like we can't have differing opinions because we're sort of assuming that our stance would cause too much tension or would trigger the other person, and then we absorb that tension. If your heart is saying no, but you say yes verbally, what you're doing is you're abandoning your highest self for the sake of someone else or for the sake of keeping the peace. You're placing too much importance on that peacekeeping aspect or on somebody else's emotional state than your very own emotional state. When you say yes, when you really mean no, you're creating this internal conflict within yourself. And you are going to have to speak to that at some point. And usually where I speak to that is at 4 a.m. or 2 a.m. or when I'm trying to go to sleep. When I'm at conflict, when I'm doing one thing and I believe in my soul something else, that is gonna surface as a war. And that triggers so many feelings of anxiety. And I'm not a sleep expert. I'm not an anxiety expert. And I'm definitely not a psychologist or a therapist or anything like that. But what I would say is that the majority of my own anxiety and other people's anxieties that I have come to understand through their stories that they share with me, most anxiety is caused by an internal war within yourself where you're saying yes to one thing, but your heart says no. Or you are doing one thing, but your highest self is like, please don't do that. Please go a different path. And so with that said, I'd encourage you to do some work around this. Is there an area in your life where you have a hard time saying no or going against the grain? And this can even be saying no to yourself, right? There are aspects of yourself that sometimes you have a hard time saying no to. You could have a hard time saying no to somebody else that's standing right in front of you, or you had a hard time saying no to yourself, and getting in alignment or being on that same page. So here are some questions for you to ponder. What is so bad about someone's negative reaction? What is bad about your negative reaction? Am I okay having negative reactions to someone else? Can I disagree with someone without it being emotionally charged? And if not, why not? Sometimes what happens is that we straight up avoid topics that have emotional charge in order to keep the peace. But in doing so, we don't allow our own voice to be heard. So all that to say that when we feel that our disagreement is the cause of someone else's trigger or tension, or by saying no, that we cause somebody else to become uncomfortable or emotional, that's sort of like taking their reaction personally. That's shouldering the responsibility for their reaction. It kind of takes that flavor of that first point we talked about, it's all my fault, or taking that personally. But I think that this comes with a word of caution. I think that we could be careful here. Do not be heartless with your words. It could be very easy to, especially if you have this charge, if you have somebody that you don't like, it can be really easy to be like, well, your reaction is not my responsibility. And then you say really mean things. This is classic sibling rivalry. You say things that cut them deep, and it cuts them deep. And you sort of stand back and be like, well, your responsibility is not my reaction. That's not what I'm talking about here. It's more of like when you come from a place of being neutral in stance and neutral with your language and being open-minded and respectful that somebody else has perhaps a differing opinion, but you're also not afraid to speak your own. That's what I'm talking about. And maybe that's the point here. The way to figure this out, am I being heartless or am I just having good boundaries, is like, are you having mutual respect for somebody else? Do you honor their own path and their own decisions and their own opinions as equally valid to yours? Do you see the equality between you, or do you look down on them and then say things and write their reaction off because that's not your responsibility? I think the point is to adopt an open mind while also relying on your own intuition and your own heart. Okay, the fifth and final point I have, and the way that this shows up, is in your life's work. I have met very few people that are actually following their own path. Most of us get sucked into some version of hustling. We work jobs that we don't really like so we can put food on the table. Listen, you guys, I am no exception. I've told you before, I have a full-time job. I'm not ready to leave. It pays the bills. But we have such an aversion to walking our own path because it's really, really risky. When I first started creating my own content and becoming a coach, I especially had this story around, I'm not going to do something because I'm not going to do my life's work unless it's directly making me money from the get-go. Here's the thing, your life's work pays out in so many different ways, and you have to get over the idea that money is the only way to be rewarded for what you do. Does that make sense? You can get paid in so many different ways for doing your life's work, and some of it is financial, but other ways is that it's really fulfilling to your soul. Other ways is genuine connections. Other ways is referrals or growth. And there's so many different ways that this pays out. And if you are fixated on the financial aspect, then that will prevent you from even getting started in the first place. Because to be honest, for the first it's different for everybody, but for the first little bit, when you start embarking on your own path, I'm specifically talking about either starting your own business or putting your ideas out there, things that I would consider your life's work. What does your soul want you to contribute to the universe? Whether that's painting, or creating candles or whatever that is for you, at first, it's not going to make money. It's just not. You have to be able to be okay with that and then work through that. And I do believe that if it's your life path, you will be overly compensated for what you do in so many other ways. Does that make sense? So sometimes I think that we ask this question of how does this serve me rather than how can I be of service? And that's an obvious one, right? That's where your ego is definitely coming into play. That's where your ego is saying, what can I get versus what am I being asked to contribute? The second thing and how your ego shows up, and this is more of that taking things too personally, is being too afraid to do what makes you vulnerable. We tend to think and I'm no exception, right? If I have a post that doesn't perform well, or I get backlash on something that I say, it doesn't happen often, but when it does, I automatically think it's about me. And you guys, to be honest, it's a huge risk. It's a huge risk because this podcast and everything that I put out is incredibly near and dear to my soul. And it is a reflection of me. And so how could I not take it? It's almost like, how could I not take it personally? But again, we come back to that. If I realize that somebody else is just looking at me through their own lens, that really lifts that weight of shouldering their reaction to me. Does that make sense? Following your life's work almost always comes with courage and bravery to put your ideas or art or music or whatever is a reflection of your soul. Here's the thing. Your soul is super creative by nature. Your soul wants you to create. The question is, what do you want to create? That is your life path. That is where you're going to find your purpose. That is where you're going to find where your innate gifts and talents will benefit the whole of humanity rather than just you. That's where your calling is. That's also where you're going to be in tap with source. That's where you're going to find the most fulfillment. And so wherever that is for you and however that, meshes up in your reality, that's what's for you. But to do that, to be creative, is so risky. It's super vulnerable, especially to the ego. When I can't look to somebody else and say, I put a lot of ideas out there, and forever I was really paralyzed because I would get trapped in having to research and do all these things and rely on other people's work. And I think that there is still merit to that, right? I think that there's still merit to being like, okay, well, what did somebody else say? And not reinventing the wheel every time and actually contributing instead of just ignoring what has been put out there. I do think that there's merit to that. But at the same time, you guys, these ideas are my own. And some of them are conglomerations. Some of them come to me at the most random times. And I can only say that they're insights from source. That's the best way I can describe them. Sometimes I just have a phrase that sticks out in my head. And then all of a sudden everything clicks around that. And then that becomes a podcast episode for you. But that's risky. That risks tremendous, I could risk tremendous scrutiny for that. And I had to sort of come to this place that I had to do this. I had to put my ideas out there. If I never did, the people that I admire most, like Caroline Meese or Alan Watts or Brene Brown or Johan Hari or Phil Good or Jordan Peterson, all of these people that contribute to my life, if they had kept everything to themselves, I would never have been able to benefit from them. And so who am I to withhold what's coming through me from you? Does that make sense? So sometimes I think that the fear of putting our thoughts or ideas or our creative endeavors out into the universe, from materializing them, doing your life's work, might sometimes be disguised as being humble. But I'm going to get really honest with you guys here. The withholding of your gifts is not humble. It's egoic. And if no one has ever told you this before, I'm going to give you some tough love. But let me be the first to say that in this lifetime, it is 100% your responsibility to do the work to overcome whatever mental blocks or fears that you may have around sharing your gifts and talents with the world. Anything less than that is a disservice both to you and to humanity at large, as well as to your highest self and then what you came here to do. That's my tough love talk, you guys. We need more of these original ideas. We need more people to stand up to say no, to create what they were designed to create. I think I've said it before in an episode in the past, and I couldn't tell you where it was, but I was listening to a podcast or a YouTube, and it was somebody who had worked in hospice, and the number one regret that people were saying as they're laying on their deathbed is, I regret that I didn't have the courage to do what I came here to do. Let that sink in. For all we know, we have one life. And even though my belief system says otherwise, do you really want to take that chance? What's the worst that could happen? Don't make it about you. Make it about somebody else. This is for the good of everyone. All in all, I think I share all of that to say that when we take things personally, in whatever flavor it comes, whether it be just straight up taking things personally or assuming that it's your responsibility or feeling like a failed creative endeavor is a reflection of your person at large. When we take things too personally, we separate ourselves from the world around us. And the inflated sense of self either positions itself as above or below other people or its environment or a situation. And it prevents us from true communion with our lives and with everything in it, to include our own self. When I'm in ego and I'm obsessed with myself, I'm just going to keep putting on masks so that no one knows who the true me is. In doing so, that is safe, but it's going to prevent you from really knowing yourself and from knowing other people, and it'll prevent you from walking your path. Real relationship happens when you see yourself and everything and everyone else on the same level, on the same playing field, and when you show up as the true you without that fear of rejection. As long as we keep up the facade, we're never going to know our true selves and we'll never be able to connect with others on that level. And isn't that what life is all about? It's all about connection. Okay, I feel like I got really intense at the end, and I'm sorry if you feel like I was yelling at you. I'm not yelling at you. I just wanted to give you a solid pep talk, because you know what? Sometimes we need it, and we live in a society that just totally shies away from good, solid, tough love and those pep talks when they're necessary. So here I am. I will always give it to you straight. That is my promise to you. Okay, you guys, that's all I have for you this time. I will see you next week. If you enjoyed this episode, I would invite you to subscribe, share it with someone you know, and leave an honest rating or review. You can also connect with me through Instagram at spiritmind.body, through YouTube, or my website. Links to all of these can be found in the show notes below. This work is not easy and requires tremendous self-reflection, grit, and a willingness to be misunderstood, and for that, I honor every single one of you for showing up for your authentic self. Until next time. Hey you guys, thank you so much for sticking around to the very, very end with me. I just have one last announcement for you. If you enjoy these episodes and you would like me to produce them every week instead of every other week, which is something that I would love to do for you, there is a donate link down below. What this helps me do is outsource some of these things that I just don't have that much time for, such as editing and producing this podcast. If you don't know me, I am a mother to 2 very little kids, and I have a full-time job already. And your donations really help offset some of the costs that it takes to produce on a weekly basis. Also, if you do not know me, if you have not connected with me, I'm primarily on Instagram at spiritmind.body. I would love to hear from you. My last episode of the season, which will be in April, is going to be a Q&A. So if you have any questions, comments, any way that you'd like to connect with me, please do head over to Instagram or on YouTube. Drop me a comment or a message. I would love to hear from you. Thank you guys. I love you guys so much. I will see you next week.